For 23 years, Margaret Chin filed property records without asking questions, maintaining the invisible machinery of bureaucracy in a city that had forgotten how to remember its own stories. But when a single envelope arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, it shattered the careful walls she had built around her predictable life. Inside those cream-colored pages lay a mystery that had waited 60 years to be solved. A Victorian mansion held in trust, a woman who lived alone for decades in Pacific Heights luxury, and a wealthy developer's cryptic confession about a debt that could never be repaid. What Margaret discovered in those dusty archives would lead her into the private world of Sarah Morrison, a woman who systematically erased parts of her own history while preserving others, who kept journals for 7 decades yet cut away the pages that mattered most. Behind every property record lies a human story. Behind every legal document hides a secret someone hoped would stay buried. And behind the elegant facade of 2847 Pacific Avenue waits a truth that will force Margaret to choose between professional detachment and the dangerous pull of a mystery that increasingly mirrors the loneliness of her own carefully constructed life. Some stories demand to be told, even when those who lived them tried desperately to keep them silent. Some secrets, once unearthed, change not just the past but the future of people who never knew they were connected to something larger than themselves. If you want to discover what Margaret found in that silent house, what revelations waited in boxes of yellowed letters and journals with missing pages, subscribe to our channel. Leave a like if you believe some mysteries deserve to be solved, and comment telling us where you are watching from. This is a story about the traces we leave behind and the truths that refuse to stay hidden. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Margaret Chen's cluttered desk at the county recorder's office, where towers of manila folders stood like monuments to bureaucratic tedium. For 23 years she had been the invisible guardian of San Francisco's property records, her fingers dancing across keyboards with mechanical precision, her eyes scanning documents that represented dreams, disasters, and everything in between. Most people walked past her window without a second glance, but Margaret had long ago made peace with her invisibility. In this city of technological marvels and startup millionaires, she was simply part of the furniture, as permanent and unremarkable as the water-stained ceiling tiles above her head. She had developed a rhythm over the decades, a comfortable routine that insulated her from the chaos of the world beyond her filing cabinets. Coffee at 8:15 precisely. Lunch at noon, always the same turkey sandwich from the deli on Market Street. A brief walk around the block at 3 o'clock to stretch her legs and remind herself that sunlight still existed. Then back to her desk until 5:30, when she would catch the 38 Geary bus home to her modest Richmond district apartment, where her cat Humphrey would be waiting by the window, his orange tail twitching with impatience. It was a small life, perhaps, but it was hers, and she had cultivated it carefully, like a bonsai tree shaped by patient, deliberate hands. But today something felt different. Margaret couldn't quite articulate what it was. A subtle shift in the air, perhaps, or the way the light fell across her workspace with an unusual intensity. She had learned long ago to trust these intuitions, these whispers of awareness that occasionally broke through the static of routine. Her grandmother, who had fled Shanghai during the revolution, used to call it the knowing, a gift passed down through generations of Qin women who had survived wars, famines, and the endless upheavals of history by paying attention to what others dismissed as coincidence or imagination. The morning had been unremarkable enough. She had processed 17 property transfers, updated 6 deed records, and answered countless phone calls from attorneys and title companies who treated her like a search engine rather than a human being. But then, just before lunch, a young courier had arrived with a worn leather satchel, his bicycle helmet still strapped to his chin, his face flushed from exertion. He had handed her a priority delivery envelope marked time-sensitive legal documents, and asked her to sign for it with an urgency that seemed excessive for routine paperwork. Now, as she sat alone in the office during the afternoon lull when most of her colleagues were scattered across the building on various errands, Margaret opened the envelope with her usual methodical care. Inside was a single sheet of expensive cream-colored stationery, the kind that spoke of old money and established law firms. The letterhead read, Whitmore, Davidson and Associates, Attorneys at Law, established 1889. The firm's address placed them in one of those hushed, wood-paneled buildings near the Ferry Building, where senior partners charged hourly rates that exceeded Margaret's weekly salary. The letter itself was brief, almost painfully so given the weight of its implications. It requested that she search the property records for a specific address, 2847 Pacific Avenue, a location that meant nothing to her at first glance. But as she read further, her hands began to tremble slightly, an involuntary response that surprised her with its intensity. The letter explained that this property had been held in a trust for over 60 years, and that the trust was now being dissolved following the recent death of its sole beneficiary. The attorneys needed confirmation of ownership history, liens, and any other encumbrances dating back to 1962. What made Margaret's pulse quicken wasn't the request itself. She handled similar inquiries regularly. It was the name listed as the original trustee, Lawrence Edward Whitmore. She knew that name. Everyone who had worked in property records for any length of time knew that name. Whitmore had been one of San Francisco's most influential real estate developers in the post-war era, a man whose fingerprints were on half the buildings in Pacific Heights and whose reputation was built on both brilliance and ruthlessness. He had died in 1995, but his legacy lingered in the city's skyline and in countless property disputes that still occasionally surfaced in the courts. Margaret pulled up her database with practiced efficiency, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she entered the address. The screen flickered, then populated with information that made her lean forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she squinted at the details. The property had indeed been purchased in 1962, but the circumstances were unusual to say the least. The original deed showed a purchase price of $1, a symbolic amount that suggested this wasn't a typical real estate transaction. The buyer of record was listed as Sarah Catherine Morrison, but ownership had been immediately transferred to the Whitmore Family Trust, with Lawrence Whitmore serving as trustee and Sarah Morrison as beneficiary. But what caught Margaret's attention, what made her heart beat faster with the thrill of discovery that occasionally broke through her professional detachment, was a note attached to the file. It was handwritten, in the elegant cursive of someone trained before typewriters became ubiquitous, and it was dated March 15, 1962. The note was brief but cryptic. Per agreement with LEW property to be held in perpetuity for SKM and her descendants. No sale or transfer without written consent of beneficiary or legal heirs. See attached covenant. Margaret clicked through to the covenant, a legal document that had been scanned into the system during the county's digitization project in the early 2000s. The language was dense, filled with the archaic legalese that characterized mid-century property law, but the essence was clear. Sarah Morrison had been granted lifetime use of the property, with ownership reverting to the Whitmore Trust upon her death, at which point the property would be sold and the proceeds distributed according to the terms of the trust. But there was a provision that made Margaret pause, her finger hovering over the mouse as she read it again to make sure she understood correctly. If Sarah Morrison had any living descendants at the time of her death, those descendants would have first right of refusal to purchase the property at fair market value, with payment terms to be negotiated in good faith. Furthermore, any such descendants would be entitled to receive a full accounting of how the property had been managed during the years it was held in trust, including all rental income, maintenance expenses, and property tax payments. It was an unusual arrangement, generous in some ways but also laden with complications that suggested there was more to this story than a simple real estate transaction. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing with questions that she knew were none of her business but that she couldn't help asking nonetheless. Who was Sarah Morrison? Why had Lawrence Whitmore essentially given her this valuable property? What relationship had existed between them that would prompt such an unusual legal arrangement? And most intriguing of all, were there descendants who had no idea they might have a claim to a property that, given its Pacific Heights location, was likely worth millions in today's market? The afternoon light had shifted, casting her office in a golden glow that made the dust motes dance like tiny stars suspended in amber. Margaret's hands moved with deliberate precision as she pulled up additional records, her curiosity now fully awakened despite the voice in her head that warned her against getting emotionally involved in what should be purely professional research. The database revealed layers of information that painted an increasingly intriguing picture of 2847 Pacific Avenue and its mysterious beneficiary. Property tax records showed that payments had been made consistently, never once falling into arrears over 6 decades. A remarkable feat that suggested either considerable wealth or meticulous financial management. The assessed value had climbed steadily from $85,000 in 1962 to its current valuation of $4.2 million, reflecting Pacific Heights' transformation from a merely desirable neighborhood into one of the most expensive zip codes in America. She clicked through to the building permits section, discovering that the property, a 3-story Victorian with original bay windows and ornate cornices, had been maintained with obvious care. Permits for roof repairs in 1978, foundation work in 1989, complete electrical rewiring in 2003, seismic retrofitting in 2015. Each improvement represented thousands of dollars in expenditure, all presumably paid from the trust. Margaret found herself wondering about the mechanics of such an arrangement. Had Sarah Morrison lived there alone all those years? Had she worked, or had the trust provided for her living expenses as well? The covenant mentioned rental income, which suggested the property might have been divided into units, a common practice in San Francisco where even modest homes were frequently converted to maximize income potential. Margaret pulled out a yellow legal pad. She still preferred paper for her notes. Finding the physical act of writing helped her think more clearly, and began jotting down questions that extended far beyond the scope of the attorney's request. She knew she should simply compile the information they had asked for and move on to her next task, but something about this case had hooked itself into her imagination like a burr catching on fabric. Perhaps it was the romance of it, the suggestion of a hidden story playing out over decades in a city that was constantly reinventing itself, constantly erasing its own history in favor of the next big thing. Or perhaps it was something in her own life, some longing for connection to narratives larger than her daily routine, that made her want to understand what had bound Lawrence Whitmore and Sarah Morrison together in this peculiar legal arrangement. The clock on her wall showed 3:15, time for her usual walk, but Margaret remained at her desk, drawn deeper into the digital archives. She searched for Sarah Morrison's name in the death records database, her heart beating a little faster as she waited for results to load. The system was notoriously slow, its interface designed in the early 2000s and never properly updated despite countless complaints from staff members who had watched other government agencies modernize while their own department languished in bureaucratic limbo. When the results finally appeared, Margaret felt a small jolt of satisfaction mixed with something closer to sadness. Sarah Catherine Morrison had died 3 months ago, on August 14, at the age of 87. The death certificate listed her address as 2847 Pacific Avenue, so she had lived there until the end. Margaret noted with a pang of sympathy for this woman she had never met. The cause of death was listed as congestive heart failure, a common enough end for someone of advanced age, but Margaret couldn't help imagining the final days in that Victorian house, wondering if Sarah had been alone or surrounded by family, whether she had died peacefully or with unfinished business weighing on her mind. The certificate listed no next of kin, a detail that struck Margaret as profoundly melancholy. To live nearly 9 decades and leave no one behind to mark your passing seemed almost unbearably lonely. But the absence of listed heirs made the covenant's provision for descendants even more puzzling. Had there been children who predeceased her? Grandchildren who had lost touch over the years? Or had Sarah Morrison lived a solitary life in that Pacific Heights mansion, maintaining it like a shrine to whatever relationship she had shared with Lawrence Whitmore? Margaret found herself constructing narratives, each more elaborate than the last. Perhaps Sarah had been Whitmore's mistress, installed in the house as compensation for years of discretion. Perhaps she had been a relative he was obligated to support, a wayward sister or daughter from a youthful indiscretion. Perhaps she had known damaging secrets about his business dealings, and the house was the price of her silence. Each theory felt both plausible and insufficient, failing to capture what Margaret sensed was a more complex truth. She had worked with property records long enough to recognize the difference between transactional arrangements and those born from genuine care. The way this trust had been structured, the provisions for Sarah's security and comfort, the careful maintenance of the property over decades, these details suggested something more than simple obligation or hush money. They spoke of responsibility willingly assumed, of a promise kept even beyond death. Lawrence Whitmore had died in 1995, yet the trust had continued to function seamlessly for another 3 decades, ensuring that Sarah Morrison lived out her days in security and comfort. Margaret pulled up the historical property records, searching for the transaction that had first brought 2847 Pacific Avenue into Lawrence Whitmore's orbit. The house had been built in 1898 by a ship captain named Edmund Carlisle, whose fortune was made in the China trade during San Francisco's rambunctious early years. It had passed through several owners before 1962, each recorded in the meticulous handwriting of Margaret's predecessors, those anonymous clerks whose ink signatures were now preserved in digital amber. The 1962 transaction showed that Whitmore had purchased the property from the estate of Marcus and Helena Thornton for $78,000, a substantial sum for the era but not excessive for a Pacific Heights Victorian, even one that needed work. What happened next was where the story became interesting. Within a week of purchasing the property, Whitmore had transferred it to the trust with Sarah Morrison as beneficiary. Margaret cross-referenced the dates and discovered something that made her sit up straighter in her chair, her pulse quickening with the thrill of discovery. Sarah Morrison's previous address, listed on the property transfer documents, was 2847 Pacific Avenue, the same address. She had been living in the Thornton house before Whitmore purchased it, which suggested she might have been a tenant, or perhaps had worked for the Thorntons in some capacity. Had they been family friends? Had Sarah been a housekeeper, a companion to the elderly Thorntons? The pieces were starting to fit together in a pattern that Margaret could almost but not quite discern. She imagined a young Sarah Morrison. She would have been in her mid-20s in 1962, living in that grand Victorian house, perhaps caring for aging owners who had no children of their own. When they died, the house passed to distant relatives who wanted to sell, and Sarah faced eviction. Enter Lawrence Whitmore, already a rising figure in San Francisco real estate, who somehow learned of Sarah's situation and intervened. But why? What motivated a successful businessman to essentially give away a valuable property to a young woman who had no apparent claim on his generosity? Margaret's imagination painted scenes with cinematic clarity. Sarah answering the door to find Whitmore standing on the steps, hat in hand, bearing news of the house's fate. The desperate search for affordable housing in a city where rents were already climbing. Whitmore's unexpected offer, delivered perhaps in the formal parlor with its high ceilings and elaborate plasterwork. Sarah's disbelief, her cautious hope, her eventual acceptance of an arrangement that must have seemed too good to be true. And then the decades that followed, years during which the city transformed around her while she remained anchored in that house, a fixed point in a swirling universe of change. The office phone rang, shattering Margaret's reverie with its harsh electronic trill. She answered mechanically, her mind still half lost in the past, and found herself speaking with a title company representative who needed verification on a completely unrelated property. She provided the information efficiently, her professional competence operating on autopilot while her thoughts remained with Sarah Morrison and Lawrence Whitmore. When she hung up, she glanced at the clock and was startled to discover that nearly 2 hours had passed since she had opened the envelope from Whitmore, Davidson and Associates. Margaret knew she should stop digging, should compile the basic information requested by the attorneys and close the file with professional detachment. Yet something deeper than curiosity compelled her forward, a sense that she had stumbled onto a story that deserved to be understood rather than merely processed as data points in a legal transaction. She had spent 2 decades watching San Francisco transform itself, watching historic buildings demolished to make way for glass towers, watching neighborhoods gentrified beyond recognition, watching the city's soul slowly eroded by market forces that reduced everything to monetary value. Here, in the story of Sarah Morrison and Lawrence Whitmore, she sensed something different, a narrative of continuity and care that spoke to a version of the city that was rapidly disappearing. The problem was that property records could only tell her so much. They provided the skeleton of the story but not its flesh, the legal framework but not the human motivations that animated it. Margaret found herself thinking about the gaps in the narrative, the crucial information that existed nowhere in her databases. What had Sarah Morrison done with her days in that Victorian house? Had she filled it with friends and laughter, or had she lived like a ghost haunting rooms filled with memories? Had she appreciated the gift Whitmore had given her, or had she felt trapped by obligation and gratitude? And most pressingly, were there descendants out there who had no idea they might inherit not just property but a piece of San Francisco history? Margaret glanced around her office at the familiar landscape of filing cabinets and outdated computer equipment, at the window that looked out onto the parking lot where pigeons pecked at scattered French fries dropped by careless pedestrians. She thought about her own life, its comfortable predictability, the way she had constructed walls of routine to protect herself from disappointment and heartbreak. After her divorce 15 years ago, a mercifully brief marriage to a man who had turned out to be far more interested in the idea of a wife than in actually knowing her, Margaret had retreated into work and solitude, convincing herself that this was a choice rather than a failure of courage. She had her cat, her apartment, her carefully cultivated garden of small pleasures. It was enough, she told herself. It had to be enough. But looking at Sarah Morrison's life through the cold lens of property records, Margaret felt an unexpected kinship with this woman she had never met. Sarah too had apparently lived alone, had apparently built a life within carefully defined boundaries. Yet there was something in the way her story intersected with Lawrence Whitmore's that suggested depths Margaret couldn't access through official documents. She made a decision then, one that surprised her with its spontaneity, that violated her usual caution about overstepping professional boundaries. She would try to find out more about Sarah Morrison, not just for the attorneys who had requested the property information, but for herself, to satisfy the hunger for meaningful connection that she usually kept carefully suppressed. Margaret pulled out her personal cell phone. She never used county equipment for anything that wasn't strictly work-related, and opened a browser window. She typed Sarah Morrison San Francisco obituary, into the search bar and waited while the algorithm sifted through millions of pages. The results appeared almost instantly, a testament to the speed of modern information retrieval that still occasionally amazed her despite daily use. The San Francisco Chronicle had published a brief obituary 3 months ago, just a few paragraphs that summarized an entire life in bland, generic terms that revealed almost nothing. Sarah Catherine Morrison, 87, longtime resident of Pacific Heights, passed away peacefully on August 14. Born in Oakland in 1937, Sarah lived most of her adult life in San Francisco. She was known for her love of classical music and her volunteer work with the San Francisco Public Library. A private memorial service was held. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library. Margaret read the obituary 3 times, mining it for details that weren't explicitly stated. The absence of survivors listed was telling, though not conclusive. Some families preferred privacy, especially in an age where obituaries were instantly searchable online. The mention of volunteer work suggested Sarah had been engaged with her community, not a complete recluse. The classical music detail painted a picture of refinement, perhaps of a woman who had cultivated her own inner world with careful attention to beauty and culture. But the obituary's brevity and generic quality frustrated Margaret, who had hoped for richer information, for clues that might illuminate the relationship with Lawrence Whitmore or hint at hidden descendants. She expanded her search, trying different combinations of terms, adding Pacific Heights and 2847 Pacific Avenue to her queries. This produced a handful of results, most of them mundane: mentions in neighborhood association newsletters, a letter to the editor about proposed zoning changes from 1994, a photograph from a 1982 Chronicle article about Victorian architecture that showed Sarah's house as an example of well-preserved 19th-century craftsmanship. Margaret clicked on the architecture article and found herself staring at a photograph of 2847 Pacific Avenue in all its glory, the ornate facade lovingly maintained, the bay windows gleaming in afternoon sunlight, flower boxes overflowing with geraniums that suggested someone cared deeply about the house's appearance. Standing on the front steps in the photograph was a woman Margaret assumed must be Sarah Morrison. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, slender and elegant in a way that suggested natural grace rather than studied fashion. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore a cardigan and slacks that spoke of understated good taste. But it was her expression that caught Margaret's attention, a slight smile that seemed to contain both contentment and sadness, as if she were simultaneously at peace with her life and aware of everything it lacked. Her hand rested on the ornate iron railing, a possessive gesture that suggested deep attachment to the house, a sense of belonging that went beyond mere residence. Margaret found herself studying the photograph with an intensity that bordered on obsession, trying to read Sarah's character from pixels on a screen. What had she been thinking when this picture was taken? Had she known then that she would spend the rest of her life in that house, that it would become both sanctuary and limitation? Had she ever wondered about alternative paths, roads not taken, possibilities foreclosed by accepting Whitmore's generosity? Margaret projected her own questions onto Sarah's frozen smile, recognizing that she was really interrogating herself, asking whether the safe choices she had made in her own life had been wisdom or cowardice. The office had grown quiet around her, that particular late afternoon hush that descends on government buildings when most employees have mentally checked out even if their bodies remain at their desks. Margaret glanced at the clock and saw it was nearly 5, time to begin her shutdown routine, to clear her workspace and prepare for tomorrow's inevitable tide of paperwork. But instead of following her usual pattern, she made another impulsive decision. She picked up her desk phone and dialed the number listed on the letterhead from Whitmore, Davidson and Associates, half hoping she would get voicemail, that she could leave a message and avoid actual human interaction that might reveal how emotionally invested she had become in what should be a routine records request. The phone rang twice before a crisp female voice answered. Whitmore, Davidson and Associates, how may I direct your call? Margaret's mouth went dry, her carefully prepared speech suddenly evaporating from her mind. She cleared her throat and tried to sound professional rather than like someone who had spent the afternoon obsessing over a stranger's life. This is Margaret Chin from the county recorder's office. I'm calling about the property records request for 2847 Pacific Avenue. I've completed the research, but I have some questions that might be relevant to the case. There was a brief pause, the sound of fingers typing on a keyboard. One moment please, I'll connect you with Mr. Davidson. He's handling that estate. Before Margaret could respond, hold music filled her ear, something classical and vaguely baroque that Sarah Morrison might have appreciated. Margaret's heart pounded with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. She was just doing her job, she told herself. There was nothing inappropriate about seeking clarification on a legal matter. Yet she knew she was lying to herself, that her motivations went far beyond professional thoroughness, that she was seeking entry into a story that had captivated her imagination in ways she couldn't quite articulate or justify. The hold music cut off abruptly, replaced by a male voice that carried the slightly impatient tone of someone interrupted during important work. "This is Richard Davidson. You have information about the Pacific Avenue property?" Margaret took a deep breath, committing herself to a path that felt both reckless and necessary. "Yes, Mr. Davidson. I've compiled the ownership history you requested, but I discovered some unusual provisions in the original trust documents. Specifically, there's a covenant regarding potential descendants of Sarah Morrison and their rights to the property. I wanted to confirm whether you're aware of this provision and whether it affects your handling of the estate." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the connection had dropped, if Richard Davidson had simply hung up on her rather than engage with what he might perceive as an officious clerk overstepping her boundaries. But then she heard him exhale slowly, a sound that carried equal parts frustration and resignation, the exhalation of someone confronting a complication they had hoped to avoid. "You've read the covenant thoroughly, I take it?" Davidson's voice had shifted, losing its initial impatience and gaining a quality Margaret couldn't quite identify, perhaps wariness, perhaps something closer to respect for someone who had done more than the minimum required. "Most records clerks just pull the basic ownership history and call it a day. You've actually gone through the attached legal documents." Margaret felt a flush of vindication mixed with embarrassment at being so transparent. "It's part of my job to provide complete information, Mr. Davidson. The covenant seems fairly explicit about descendant rights, and given that it was written over 60 years ago, I thought it might have implications for how the estate is settled. I wanted to make sure you had all the relevant documentation before proceeding." She heard papers rustling on Davidson's end, the creak of an expensive leather chair, the ambient sounds of a high-end law office that existed in a different universe from her utilitarian government workspace. When he spoke again, his tone had softened considerably, taking on an almost confessional quality that surprised Margaret with its candor. "Miss Chin, you've touched on what has become something of a puzzle for our firm. The truth is, we've been trying to locate any living descendants of Sarah Morrison for the past 3 months without success. The covenant you mentioned isn't just relevant, it's potentially the most important document in the entire estate." Margaret's pulse quickened, her grip tightening on the phone receiver as she sensed she was about to learn something significant, something that would deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. "I noticed the death certificate listed no next of kin. But surely there must be some family history, some records that would indicate whether she had children or siblings." Davidson's laugh was dry, humorless, the sound of someone who had spent too many hours chasing phantom leads down dead-end corridors. "You would think so, wouldn't you? But Sarah Morrison appears to have been remarkably private about her personal life. We've searched birth records, marriage records, genealogical databases, nothing. No record of marriage, no record of children, no siblings listed in any documentation we can find. Her parents died in a car accident in 1955 when she was 18, leaving her orphaned with no apparent extended family. It's as if she simply materialized as an adult and lived the next 6 decades without forming any significant family connections." Margaret found herself leaning forward in her chair, her professional reserve crumbling in the face of genuine intrigue. That seems almost impossible in this day and age. Everyone leaves a paper trail: tax records, employment history, social security documentation. Surely something would indicate relationships, connections to other people? "Oh, there's documentation of her existence," Davidson assured her, his voice taking on the weary quality of someone who had reviewed too many documents that raised more questions than they answered. "Tax returns filed religiously every year, showing modest income from the property rental units and some kind of part-time work, though the employer information is vague. Social security payments received after she turned 67. Medical records from her doctors, though those are sealed by privacy laws and we've only been able to access the most basic information. But nothing that suggests intimate relationships, nothing that points to children or close friends who might know about potential heirs." Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, each more elaborate than the last. What about the volunteer work mentioned in her obituary? The library system must have records of volunteers, contact information, perhaps references from people who worked with her. She heard Davidson typing, the rapid-fire clicking of someone searching through digital files while maintaining a conversation. We contacted the library, of course. Sarah volunteered there for almost 30 years, mostly in the music and performing arts section, helping to catalog recordings and organize listening programs. The librarians who remembered her described her as pleasant but intensely private, someone who was reliably present but who never shared personal information or attended staff social events. One woman who worked with her for 15 years said she couldn't recall Sarah ever mentioning family, friends, or even plans for holidays or vacations. It was as if her entire identity was contained within her work at the library and whatever life she lived in that Victorian house. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, recognizing in Sarah's isolation an extreme version of her own carefully constructed solitude. But where Margaret had her colleagues at work, her neighbors who nodded in passing, her sister in Portland who called monthly, the minimal but real connections that tethered her to the human world, Sarah seemed to have existed in almost complete isolation. It painted a picture that was both achingly lonely and somehow deliberate, as if Sarah had chosen invisibility as a kind of protection against something Margaret couldn't identify. "Mr. Davidson," Margaret said slowly, choosing her words carefully as an idea began forming in her mind, fragile as morning mist but growing more substantial with each passing moment. "The original trust documents, do they provide any explanation for why Lawrence Whitmore created this arrangement? Any correspondence or memoranda that might shed light on his relationship with Sarah Morrison?" The lawyer's hesitation was palpable, a pregnant pause that suggested he was weighing how much to reveal to someone who was technically just a county employee with no official role in the estate settlement. But when he spoke, Margaret sensed he had made a decision to trust her, perhaps recognizing in her persistence something more than bureaucratic curiosity. "There is one document, actually. A letter from Lawrence Whitmore to his personal attorney, written in 1962 when the trust was being established. It's not a legal document per se, more of a personal statement explaining his motivations. We found it in the firm's archives when we started working on the estate settlement." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, her breathing shallow with anticipation. "What did it say?" Davidson cleared his throat, and Margaret could picture him holding some yellowed paper, reading words written 6 decades ago by a man long dead, words that had waited all this time for someone to understand their significance. "I can't share the entire letter. Attorney-client privilege extends beyond death in certain circumstances, but I can tell you the essence of it." Whitmore wrote that he was establishing the trust to fulfill what he called a moral debt of the highest order. He stated that Sarah Morrison had, through no fault of her own, suffered losses that he felt partially responsible for, though he doesn't specify what those losses were. He wrote, and I'm quoting directly here, "She gave up everything for my sake, though I never asked it of her and would have prevented it had I known in time. The least I can do is ensure she never wants for security or comfort for the remainder of her days." Margaret sat in stunned silence, her imagination spinning out scenarios that might explain Whitmore's cryptic words. What had Sarah given up? Had she taken the blame for something Whitmore had done, perhaps sacrificing her reputation or her future to protect him? Had there been a romantic relationship that ended badly, leaving her compromised in some way that 1960 society would have punished more harshly than it punished men? Or was the truth something even more complex, some tangled web of obligation and consequence that could only be understood by knowing the full context of their relationship? "There's more," Davidson continued, his voice dropping slightly as if he were sharing a confidence. "Whitmore included a provision in his will, separate from the trust but clearly related to it, that allocated funds specifically for locating any descendants of Sarah Morrison after her death. He left instructions that if such descendants were found, they were to be informed not just about the property rights spelled out in the covenant, but about what he called the full truth of their grandmother's sacrifice. He established a sealed envelope to be given to these hypothetical descendants, an envelope that has sat in our firm's vault for nearly 30 years, since his death in 1995, waiting for recipients who may not exist." Margaret's thoughts whirled with the implications, the weight of secrets carried across generations, the burden of guilt that had motivated a wealthy man to make provisions extending decades beyond his own death. "Have you opened the envelope? Surely you need to know what information it contains to proceed with the estate." "We can't," Davidson said flatly. Whitmore's instructions were explicit and backed by ironclad legal language. The envelope can only be opened by proven descendants of Sarah Morrison, in the presence of a representative of our firm. If no descendants are found within 5 years of Sarah's death, the envelope is to be destroyed unopened and the property sold with proceeds going to charity. We have 4 years and 9 months remaining." Margaret realized she had been holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly, her mind already racing ahead to possibilities, to ways she might help unravel this mystery that had consumed her afternoon and now threatened to dominate her thoughts indefinitely. What if I could help? I have access to databases and records that might not be available to private investigators. If there are descendants out there, if Sarah had a child she gave up for adoption or a relationship that produced offspring she never acknowledged publicly, there might be traces in official records that haven't been properly connected. Davidson's response came after a long pause, during which Margaret could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the propriety of involving a county clerk in what was technically a private estate matter against the very real possibility that she might have access to resources his firm's investigators had overlooked. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of professional caution and barely suppressed hope that made Margaret realize how much this case had gotten under his skin as well, how it had transformed from a routine estate settlement into something more personal, more meaningful. Miss Chen, what you're proposing is highly irregular. You understand that, don't you? I would be essentially enlisting a government employee to conduct research on behalf of a private client, research that goes well beyond the scope of your official duties. There are ethical considerations, potential conflicts of interest, questions about the appropriate use of county resources. He paused, and Margaret heard the subtle shift in his tone that signaled he was about to contradict everything he had just said. That being said, I've been practicing estate law for 27 years, and I've never encountered a case quite like this one. The provisions Whitmore made, the careful construction of the trust, the sealed envelope, all of it suggests a story that deserves to be uncovered, not just for the sake of legal resolution but because there's something important buried in this history, something that mattered deeply to at least two people and might matter to others we haven't yet identified. Margaret found herself nodding even though Davidson couldn't see her, recognizing in his words the same compulsion that had gripped her from the moment she opened that cream-colored envelope. I would do the research on my own time, using publicly accessible databases that anyone could theoretically search. It wouldn't be an official investigation, just a private citizen with some expertise in records management pursuing a question that interests her. You wouldn't be hiring me or compensating me in any way. I would simply be someone who happened to discover information that might be relevant to your case and chose to share it with you. The rationalization sounded thin even to Margaret's own ears, a careful dance around regulations that existed to prevent exactly this kind of entanglement between public servants and private interests. But she found she didn't care about the technical impropriety, not when weighed against the possibility of solving a mystery that had haunted Lawrence Whitmore for decades, that had shaped Sarah Morrison's entire adult life, that might still have profound implications for someone out there who had no idea they were connected to this story. Margaret, who had spent 23 years coloring carefully within the lines of bureaucratic propriety, was shocked to discover how little those boundaries meant when confronted with something that genuinely mattered. If you were to pursue this as a private citizen, Davidson said carefully, his lawyer's precision evident in every word, and if you happen to discover information that might be relevant to locating potential heirs, I suppose there would be no ethical barrier to you sharing that information with our firm. We would of course be grateful for any assistance, though as you say, there could be no formal compensation or official arrangement. It would simply be one person helping another with a puzzle that has proven remarkably difficult to solve through conventional means. Margaret felt a flutter of excitement in her chest, a sensation she barely recognized because it had been so long since anything in her life had generated genuine anticipation rather than mere routine satisfaction. Then I'll start tonight. I have access to genealogical databases through my library card, and there are public records I can search from home. If Sarah Morrison had a child, even one given up for adoption or born out of wedlock, there should be some trace in California records. Birth certificates, adoption papers, social services documentation. All of it leaves paper trails that most people don't realize exist. One thing you should know, Davidson interjected, his voice taking on a more somber quality that made Margaret pay closer attention, sensing he was about to reveal something significant. We did find one interesting detail in Sarah's personal effects when we inventoried the house contents last month. She kept extensive journals, filling dozens of leather-bound books over the decades. Beautiful handwriting, daily entries recording her thoughts, observations, and experiences. But here's what's strange. Every single journal has pages that have been carefully removed, excised with what looks like a razor blade. The missing pages aren't random. They cluster around certain dates, creating gaps in the narrative that seem deliberate, almost surgical. Someone, presumably Sarah herself, went through her journals and removed specific content, pages that apparently contained information she didn't want preserved. Margaret's mind immediately began cataloging possibilities, her years of archival work making her acutely aware of what missing documents might signify. Do the gaps correspond to any particular time periods? Are they concentrated around certain years or spread randomly throughout? She heard Davidson rustling papers, the sound of someone flipping through notes or reports compiled by others. Our associate who inventoried the journals noted that the largest gaps occur in the early 1960s, particularly around 1962 and 1963, the same period when Whitmore established the trust. There are also significant gaps in journals from the late 1950s, when Sarah would have been in her late teens and early 20s. After that, the gaps become less frequent but still appear sporadically throughout her life, usually just a few pages here and there, as if she were removing references to specific events or people rather than wholesale eliminating entire periods. Margaret felt the familiar tingle of investigative instinct, the same sensation she experienced when property records revealed patterns that pointed toward hidden truths. That suggests she was trying to erase evidence of something specific, not just protecting her general privacy. People who keep journals for decades usually do so because they value the record of their lives. To then go back and systematically remove content requires strong motivation, either to protect herself or to protect someone else. Or to protect secrets that she felt shouldn't survive her, Davidson added quietly. We've considered the possibility that the missing pages documented whatever relationship existed between Sarah and Lawrence Whitmore, that she removed them to prevent speculation or scandal after her death. But that doesn't explain why she kept the journals at all if she was so concerned about privacy. Why not destroy them entirely rather than leaving these obvious gaps that practically scream, something important has been hidden here? Margaret pondered this question, her thoughts drifting back to the photograph she had found earlier, to Sarah Morrison's enigmatic smile and the way her hand rested possessively on the iron railing of her Pacific Heights home. Maybe she wanted someone to know there was a story, even if she couldn't bring herself to tell it explicitly. Maybe the gaps are breadcrumbs, clues left for someone perceptive enough to recognize that absence itself can be a form of communication. The idea resonated with Margaret in ways that went beyond the current investigation, touching something deeper about her own relationship with truth and concealment. How many times had she edited her own life story, omitting details that seemed too painful or too revealing, creating her own kind of gaps in the narrative she presented to the world? Her marriage had failed, but she never spoke about the loneliness that had preceded the divorce, the growing realization that she had married an idea of partnership rather than an actual person. Her parents had died within 6 months of each other 3 years ago, but she rarely mentioned how their deaths had severed her last real family connection, leaving her floating in a social void she had tried to fill with work and routine. Everyone curated their stories, she realized, removing pages they didn't want others to read. "Miss Chin," Davidson said, pulling her back to the present conversation, "if you do decide to pursue this research, there's something else you should know. The property itself, 2847 Pacific Avenue, is currently empty but fully furnished. When Sarah died, everything was left exactly as it had been during her lifetime. Our firm has responsibility for securing and maintaining the house until the estate is settled, which means we have keys and legal access to the property. If you think it might be helpful to see where Sarah lived, to get a sense of her life beyond what documents can reveal, I could arrange for you to visit the house. Sometimes physical spaces tell stories that papers can't capture." Margaret's breath caught in her throat, the offer simultaneously thrilling and terrifying in its implications. To actually enter Sarah Morrison's home, to walk through rooms where she had lived for 60 years, to see the objects she had chosen to surround herself with, it felt almost like a violation, an intrusion into private space that should perhaps remain private. Yet she also recognized the investigative value, the way physical environments could provide context and clues that no amount of document research could match. She thought about crime scene investigators reading rooms for evidence, about archaeologists interpreting ancient lives from fragments of pottery and bone. Sarah's house would be a time capsule, a three-dimensional document waiting to be read by someone with the patience and insight to understand its language. "When could I visit?" Margaret heard herself asking, her voice steadier than she felt, committing herself fully to this strange quest that had begun only hours ago with a routine records request and had somehow evolved into something that felt like a calling, a purpose she hadn't known she was searching for until it appeared before her. "Tomorrow evening if that works for you," Davidson replied. "I have to be in court most of the day, but I could meet you at the property around 6 o'clock. Bring a notebook, you'll want to take notes. The house is remarkable, frozen in time in a way that's both beautiful and deeply melancholy. I've been there twice now, and both times I've left feeling like I've glimpsed something important but just barely missed understanding what it was." Margaret stood on the sidewalk outside 2847 Pacific Avenue as the November evening descended over San Francisco, bringing with it the particular quality of light that transforms the city into something simultaneously magical and melancholy. The Victorian house rose before her like something from another era, its elaborate facade a testament to craftsmanship that no longer existed in modern construction. 3 stories of ornate woodwork painted in subtle shades of cream and sage green, bay windows that caught the dying sunlight and reflected it back in fragmented jewels of amber and gold, a turret on the corner that suggested fairy tales and forgotten dreams. The house was beautiful in a way that transcended mere architecture, beautiful in a way that spoke of care and attention lavished over decades by someone who understood that buildings, like people, required love to truly flourish. Margaret had arrived 15 minutes early, unable to contain her anticipation, and now she stood clutching her notebook and feeling simultaneously excited and guilty about what she was about to do. This wasn't her house, wasn't her story, wasn't technically any of her business beyond the professional obligation she had already fulfilled by compiling the property records Davidson had requested. Yet here she was, about to cross a threshold into a dead woman's private world, motivated by curiosity that felt uncomfortably close to voyeurism. She thought about turning around, about calling Davidson to cancel, about retreating to the safe boundaries of her normal life where other people's secrets remained safely locked away in filing cabinets rather than demanding emotional engagement. But before she could act on her doubts, a silver Lexus pulled up to the curb and Richard Davidson emerged, looking different than Margaret had imagined him during their phone conversation. She had pictured someone older, more patrician, perhaps wearing the kind of expensive suit that announced wealth and status. Instead, Davidson appeared to be in his early 50s, dressed in casual slacks and a sweater that suggested he had come directly from somewhere other than his office. His face was kind, marked by laugh lines around his eyes and a slight weariness that suggested someone who took his responsibilities seriously, who carried the weight of other people's problems with genuine concern rather than professional detachment. "Miss Chin," he said, extending his hand with a warm smile that immediately put Margaret at ease. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would actually show up. People often express interest in getting involved with estate matters but then have second thoughts when confronted with the reality of entering someone's home after their death. It can be surprisingly emotional even when you never knew the deceased personally." Margaret shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested he did something with his hands beyond shuffling papers, perhaps gardening or woodworking. "I almost didn't come," she admitted, appreciating his directness enough to match it with her own honesty. "This feels like crossing a line I've spent my entire career respecting. But I can't stop thinking about Sarah Morrison, about the gaps in her story, about the possibility that somewhere out there someone might be entitled to inherit not just this property but the truth about where they came from." Davidson nodded, pulling a set of keys from his pocket and gesturing toward the front steps. "That's exactly how I feel. I've handled hundreds of estates over the years and most of them are straightforward. Locate the heirs, distribute the assets, file the paperwork, move on to the next case. But this one has gotten under my skin in a way I can't quite explain. Maybe it's Whitmore's obvious guilt and his elaborate attempts to make amends for whatever happened. Maybe it's Sarah's determined privacy and the way she systematically erased parts of her own history. Or maybe it's just the house itself. You'll understand what I mean once we're inside." They climbed the front steps together, their footfalls echoing on wood that had been walked upon by generations of residents, each leaving invisible impressions in the grain. Davidson fumbled slightly with the keys, trying several before finding the right one for the ornate brass lock that looked original to the house. The door swung open with a soft creak that seemed appropriate for a Victorian mansion, revealing an entrance hall that made Margaret gasp audibly despite her intention to maintain professional composure. The interior was stunning, perfectly preserved like a museum exhibition of upper-middle-class life from the mid-20th century. The walls were papered in a subtle damask pattern that had faded to soft gold, the hardwood floors gleamed with the patina that comes only from decades of careful maintenance, and a crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, catching the last rays of daylight that filtered through the transom window above the door. But what struck Margaret most forcefully was the sense of suspended time, as if Sarah Morrison had simply stepped out for an errand and might return at any moment to find strangers invading her carefully maintained sanctuary. "The power is still on," Davidson said, flipping a switch that brought the chandelier to life, filling the space with warm illumination that somehow made the emptiness more poignant. "We've kept the utilities running to prevent damage to the property and to preserve the contents in case they become relevant to the estate settlement. Everything you see is exactly as Sarah left it. We've touched nothing except to conduct a basic inventory and remove perishable food from the kitchen. Margaret moved slowly through the entrance hall, her notebook forgotten in her hand as she absorbed details that spoke volumes about the woman who had lived here. The furniture was elegant but not ostentatious, clearly expensive but chosen for comfort and durability rather than fashion. Bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with volumes that ranged from classic literature to art history to what appeared to be an extensive collection of books about classical music, biographies of composers, analyses of symphonies, histories of opera. A grand piano occupied one corner of the adjoining living room, its ebony surface dust-free and gleaming, sheet music still propped on the stand as if the pianist had simply taken a break between pieces. "Did she play?" Margaret asked, moving toward the piano with an almost reverent caution, feeling increasingly like an intruder despite Davidson's explicit permission for her presence. "According to the librarians we interviewed, she was apparently quite accomplished," Davidson replied, following her into the living room. One woman remembered Sarah mentioning that she had studied piano seriously as a young woman, had even considered pursuing it professionally before circumstances changed her plans. She never specified what those circumstances were, but given the timeline, it might have been connected to her parents' death or to whatever relationship she had with Lawrence Whitmore. Margaret ran her finger along the piano's edge, half expecting to find dust but discovering instead the smooth surface of an instrument that had been maintained with meticulous care. The sheet music on the stand was Chopin, a nocturne known for its emotional complexity and technical demands. She could almost hear the notes echoing through the empty house, could almost see Sarah sitting at the bench with her back straight and her fingers moving across the keys with practiced grace, pouring into music whatever emotions she couldn't express in words or relationships. The living room opened into a dining area that was similarly frozen in time, the table set with fine china as if Sarah had been preparing for guests who never arrived or perhaps maintaining the habits of formal dining even when eating alone. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, casting rainbow fragments across the white tablecloth that was crisp and clean despite months of neglect. Margaret found herself constructing mental images of Sarah eating solitary meals in this elegant space, perhaps reading while she ate, perhaps simply sitting with her thoughts and memories of a life that seemed to have been both privileged and profoundly lonely. "The journals are in her bedroom," Davidson said quietly, watching Margaret's face as she absorbed the atmosphere of the house. "Along with photograph albums and what appears to be a substantial collection of correspondence, though we haven't read through it yet, privacy concerns, you understand. We've tried to be respectful of Sarah's personal papers, looking only at what was necessary to establish the basic facts of the estate. But if you're going to search for descendants, you might need to examine materials we've left untouched." Margaret turned to face him, struck by the trust implicit in his offer. "You're willing to let me read her private correspondence? Letters and photographs that might contain sensitive information." Davidson's expression was thoughtful, his eyes reflecting an internal debate he seemed to have already resolved before making the offer. "Sarah Morrison is beyond being hurt by anything we might discover. And if there are descendants out there who deserve to inherit not just property but understanding of where they came from, then those people have rights that supersede Sarah's privacy." Whitmore clearly believed the truth should be revealed. That's why he created that sealed envelope, why he allocated funds for locating heirs. I think Sarah might have wanted the same thing, despite her efforts to erase certain parts of her story. Sometimes people hide things not because they want them lost forever, but because they can't bear to confront them while they're alive. Death becomes permission for truth. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the recognition that what had begun as curious investigation was evolving into something more serious, more consequential. She was no longer just a clerk searching databases for disconnected facts. She was becoming a detective of human stories, an archaeologist excavating layers of carefully buried history. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, forcing her to confront questions about her own motivations that she wasn't entirely comfortable examining too closely. "Show me the bedroom," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nervousness in her chest. "Show me where Sarah kept the pieces of her life she thought worth preserving, even if she couldn't bring herself to tell the whole truth." Davidson led Margaret up a curved staircase that seemed to float upward through the house's core, its banister carved with intricate floral patterns that would have required months of skilled labor to create. The second floor opened onto a hallway lined with doors, each presumably leading to bedrooms that had once housed the Thornton family and whatever servants they employed in an era when Pacific Heights mansions routinely maintained household staff. Most of the doors stood open, revealing rooms that were furnished but felt uninhabited, guest spaces kept ready for visitors who never materialized or perhaps had stopped coming decades ago when Sarah's isolation became complete. But the door at the end of the hallway was closed, and when Davidson turned the brass knob and pushed it open, Margaret understood immediately that this was Sarah's private sanctuary, the space where she had truly lived rather than merely existed. The bedroom was smaller than Margaret had expected, given the house's grand scale, but it possessed an intimacy that the public rooms lacked. A four-poster bed dominated one wall, its frame carved from dark walnut and topped with a quilt that appeared to be handmade, its intricate pattern of stars and flowers suggesting countless hours of patient needlework. Against the opposite wall stood a massive oak desk, its surface covered with neat stacks of papers and books, a green-shaded banker's lamp positioned precisely for reading or writing. But what captured Margaret's attention immediately, what made her breath catch in her throat with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, were the shelves that lined an entire wall from floor to ceiling, filled with identical leather-bound journals. They stood like soldiers at attention, each spine embossed with a year in gold lettering, creating a chronological archive of Sarah Morrison's inner life from 1955 through 2024. 69 years of thoughts, observations, dreams, and disappointments, recorded in what Margaret could see from across the room was elegant, consistent handwriting that spoke of discipline and intention. "It's overwhelming, isn't it?" Davidson said softly, his voice barely above a whisper as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever ghosts lingered in this space. When our associate first inventoried the contents, she spent an entire day just sitting in here, trying to process the magnitude of what Sarah had created. It's one thing to know intellectually that someone kept journals for decades, but it's another thing entirely to see them all together like this, to confront the physical evidence of a lifetime of reflection and self-documentation. Margaret moved toward the shelves slowly, drawn by a force she couldn't name or resist. Her fingers hovered over the spine of the earliest volume, dated 1955, the year Sarah's parents died and left her orphaned at 18. She pulled it from the shelf carefully, treating it with the reverence she usually reserved for historical documents in climate-controlled archives. The leather was soft with age but well-maintained, suggesting Sarah had cared for her journals as carefully as she had cared for everything else in this house. Margaret opened to the first page, where Sarah had written in a careful, youthful hand that would mature over the decades but remained recognizable as belonging to the same person. January 1, 1955. I am beginning this journal on Miss Patterson's advice. She says that writing helps clarify thoughts and feelings that seem too large or too complicated to hold inside one's head. I am not sure I have thoughts worth recording, but Mother always said that a disciplined mind requires disciplined habits, and so I shall try to write something every day, even if it is only to note the weather or what I had for breakfast. The entry was touchingly ordinary, the words of a young woman trying to establish routines that might provide structure in the wake of loss Margaret could only imagine. She flipped forward through the year, scanning entries that documented a life Margaret recognized as both privileged and constrained by the social expectations of the 1950s. Sarah had attended college classes, though it wasn't clear whether she was pursuing a degree or simply taking courses to occupy her time. She volunteered at various charitable organizations, attended concerts and lectures, practiced piano for hours each day with a dedication that suggested either genuine passion or the desperate need to fill empty hours with purposeful activity. But as Margaret moved deeper into 1955, she began to notice something that made her pulse quicken with investigative excitement. Sarah's entries grew longer, more effusive, particularly when describing a young man she referred to only as L, or sometimes, my dear friend. The prose took on qualities Margaret associated with infatuation, with the first flush of romantic attachment that makes everything seem brighter and more significant. Sarah described conversations that lasted hours, walks through Golden Gate Park where they discussed philosophy and music, evenings attending symphony performances where they sat close enough for their shoulders to touch in the darkness of the concert hall. L says I have a gift for understanding music in ways that go beyond technical proficiency, Sarah had written in an entry from April. He says I play with emotion that can't be taught, only felt. When he talks to me this way, I feel seen in a manner I have never experienced before. It is as if he perceives aspects of my character that I barely understand myself. I find myself thinking about him constantly, rehearsing conversations we might have, imagining futures that seem simultaneously impossible and inevitable. Margaret felt Davidson looking over her shoulder, reading along with her, and she glanced up to find his expression thoughtful, almost sad. This is new information, he said quietly. We knew there had to be some kind of relationship between Sarah and Whitmore, but we assumed it developed later, around 1962 when the trust was established. But if she's writing about him in 1955, when she was only 18 and he would have been, Davidson paused, clearly doing mental calculations. He would have been 33. married with 2 young children. One of San Francisco's rising business stars with a reputation to protect. Margaret turned pages carefully, watching Sarah's entries grow increasingly passionate through the spring and summer of 1955, noting how the young woman's handwriting itself seemed to change, becoming more flowing and expressive, as if happiness were manifesting in the physical act of writing. But then she reached September and suddenly the pages were gone. Clean cuts, precisely made with what must have been a razor blade or similar instrument, had removed approximately 20 pages from the journal. The gap corresponded to roughly 3 weeks in September, and when the entries resumed in early October, Sarah's tone had changed dramatically. October 3, 1955. I have been advised to stop writing about certain matters, to preserve my privacy and protect others from speculation or gossip. I find this counsel both sensible and unbearable. How does one simply cease to think about the most significant thing that has ever happened, even if one must cease to write about it? But I will comply. I understand the necessity. I understand that some things must be kept hidden, even from one's own journal, even from one's own future self who might someday read these pages and wonder what madness possessed that foolish girl who thought the world might bend to accommodate her heart's desires. Margaret looked up from the journal, meeting Davidson's eyes across the dim bedroom lit only by the banker's lamp he had switched on. She was in love with him, Margaret said, stating what now seemed obvious despite the careful evasions and removed pages. And something happened in September 1955 that forced the relationship to end or to go underground. But that was 7 years before he established the trust, 7 years before he bought this house for her. What happened in those intervening years? Davidson walked to Sarah's desk, which Margaret now noticed held not just books and papers but several small wooden boxes stacked carefully in one corner, each crafted from cedar with brass hinges that had developed a soft patina over decades. He lifted the top box with careful reverence, carrying it to where Margaret stood by the journal shelves, and set it down on the bed's quilted surface. The box was secured with a small brass clasp but no lock, suggesting Sarah had trusted that her privacy would be respected or perhaps that she had no one in her life who might violate it. We found these boxes during our initial inventory, Davidson explained, his fingers tracing the box's carved lid without opening it. They contain correspondence spanning several decades. We've only looked at the most recent letters, the ones that might help us locate contemporary contacts or family members. But the older correspondence remains essentially unexamined. Given what we've just read in the journal, I think it's time we looked at what Sarah preserved from those years between her first relationship with Whitmore and the establishment of the trust. Margaret felt her heart racing as Davidson unlatched the clasp and lifted the lid, revealing bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons that had once been vibrant colors but had mellowed to soft pastels. The letters were organized chronologically, with the earliest bundles dating from the 1950s based on the postmarks visible on the envelopes. The handwriting on the addresses varied, suggesting multiple correspondence, but Margaret immediately noticed that one particular hand appeared frequently, a bold, confident script that seemed to press firmly into the paper, creating slight indentations visible even through the envelopes. Davidson carefully extracted the earliest bundle, untying the ribbon with movements that suggested he understood he was handling something precious, something that represented not just paper and ink but preserved emotions, captured moments of connection between people long dead or disappeared. He handed the first letter to Margaret, who noticed immediately that the envelope bore no return address, only Sarah's name and an Oakland address written in that distinctive bold hand. The postmark was barely legible but appeared to read San Francisco, September 1955, the exact period when pages had been torn from Sarah's journal. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she extracted the letter from its envelope, unfolding paper that had yellowed at the edges but remained remarkably well preserved, protected by the envelope and by Sarah's obvious care in storing her correspondence. The letter was dated September 18, 1955, and began without preamble or formality, as if continuing a conversation that had been interrupted rather than initiating contact across distance. My dearest Sarah, I write this with hands that shake and a heart that breaks knowing the pain my words will cause you. But honesty, however cruel in the immediate moment, is kinder than the slow torture of sustained deception or the false hope of circumstances that cannot change. You must understand that what transpired between us, while beautiful and genuine in ways I cannot adequately express, exists outside the boundaries of what society will permit or what honor will allow me to pursue further. Margaret paused, absorbing the formal, almost stilted language that characterized educated correspondence from that era, language that seemed designed to create distance even while expressing intimacy. She continued reading, aware of Davidson watching her face as she processed information that was shifting her understanding of the relationship between Sarah Morrison and Lawrence Whitmore. My wife knows nothing of our friendship, and it must remain so. My children deserve a father whose reputation is unblemished by scandal or whispers of impropriety. You, my dear Sarah, deserve far more than I can offer. A young woman of your intelligence, beauty, and talent deserves a partner who can acknowledge her publicly, who can build a life with her unencumbered by prior obligations or societal judgment. I am 15 years your senior, bound by marriage vows I cannot in good conscience break despite the inadequacy of the partnership they represent. To continue our association would be to condemn you to a half-life lived in shadows, stealing moments while denying you the full experience of love and companionship that should be your birthright. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, each sentence a careful balance between declaration of feeling and insistence on separation, each word seeming to cost its author significant emotional effort to write. Whitmore acknowledged that their connection had been profound, that he had never experienced with anyone else the intellectual and emotional compatibility they shared, that he would carry the memory of their brief intimacy for the remainder of his life. But he remained adamant that continuing the relationship would destroy them both, would destroy his family, would destroy Sarah's reputation and future prospects, would transform something beautiful into something tainted by secrecy and shame. Margaret finished reading and looked up to find Davidson's expression grave, his professional detachment clearly challenged by the raw emotion preserved in Whitmore's careful prose. "This is a breakup letter," Margaret said unnecessarily, stating the obvious because sometimes even the obvious required articulation. "He's ending a romantic relationship that had clearly progressed beyond mere friendship, acknowledging feelings while insisting those feelings cannot be acted upon. But what I don't understand is why Sarah kept this letter, why she preserved it so carefully if it represents rejection and heartbreak." Davidson reached for the next letter in the bundle, glancing at its postmark before handing it to Margaret. Perhaps because rejection wasn't the end of the story. This one is dated November 1955, 2 months after the first letter. He wrote to her again. The second letter was shorter but no less emotionally charged, its tone shifting from formal declaration to something more conversational, more personal, as if the intervening months had eroded some of Whitmore's certainty about the necessity of complete separation. He wrote about attending a concert where he heard a Chopin nocturne performed and thought of Sarah, knowing she would have appreciated the pianist's interpretation. He mentioned a business deal that had gone through successfully and found himself wishing he could share the news with her, could discuss the strategic implications with someone who understood both the financial and human dimensions of such transactions. He concluded by acknowledging that perhaps complete severance was impossible, that perhaps they might maintain some form of friendship that honored the connection between them while respecting the boundaries imposed by his marriage and social position. Margaret worked through the bundle systematically, watching the evolution of the correspondence over the following years. Letters came irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months, but they came, maintaining a connection that Whitmore had claimed to be severing. The tone shifted gradually from formal restraint to something warmer, more intimate despite the continued insistence that their relationship must remain platonic and largely invisible to the world around them. Whitmore wrote about his work, his frustrations with business partners who lacked vision, his pride in his children's accomplishments mixed with guilt about how often his work kept him away from them. He asked about Sarah's piano studies, encouraged her to pursue performance opportunities, sent her recordings of obscure concerts he thought she would appreciate. And Sarah, based on references in Whitmore's letters to correspondence he had received from her, clearly wrote back with equal frequency and growing candor. Whitmore thanked her for insights that had helped him navigate complex negotiations, praised her wisdom beyond her years, confessed fears and doubts he apparently shared with no one else. The letters painted a picture of two people who had forged an emotional intimacy that existed parallel to but separate from Whitmore's public life. A relationship conducted through written words because direct contact would have invited scrutiny and scandal neither could afford. But then Margaret reached letters from 1962, and the tone changed dramatically once again. Whitmore's handwriting, which had remained steady and confident through years of correspondence, suddenly appeared rushed, almost agitated, as if he had written in a state of significant emotional distress. The letter was dated February 12, 1962, and began with an urgency that made Margaret's pulse quicken. "Sarah, I have only just learned of your situation, and I am devastated that you felt you couldn't tell me sooner, that you faced this alone for months while I remained ignorant of circumstances that should have been my responsibility to address. Please know that whatever you decide, whatever path forward seems best to you, I will support completely. But I must also tell you that I feel I have failed you utterly, that my insistence on maintaining distance and propriety has resulted in exactly the kind of harm I claim to be preventing." Margaret stopped reading, her mind racing ahead to implications that seemed increasingly clear yet raised as many questions as they answered. She looked at Davidson, whose expression suggested he had reached similar conclusions. "She was pregnant," Margaret said softly, the words falling into the quiet bedroom like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward in ways they couldn't yet fully anticipate. In early 1962, Sarah Morrison was pregnant with Lawrence Whitmore's child. Margaret Chen's journey into Sarah Morrison's hidden past reminds us that the stories we uncover about others often illuminate the truths we've been avoiding about ourselves. For 23 years, Margaret lived behind walls of routine and professional detachment, protecting herself from disappointment by refusing to engage too deeply with the messy, complicated realities of human connection. But sometimes a mystery arrives that demands more than our expertise. It demands our empathy, our courage, and our willingness to risk the comfortable boundaries we've constructed around our hearts. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Would you have closed the file and moved on to the next task, or would you have followed the breadcrumbs into a stranger's life, knowing that understanding someone else's buried secrets might force you to confront your own? The truth about Sarah Morrison and Lawrence Whitmore, whatever it may be, waits in those missing journal pages, in that sealed envelope Lawrence created 3 decades ago, in the silence of a house that holds memories no one alive can fully interpret. But perhaps the real question isn't what happened between them in 1962, or whether descendants exist who might inherit not just property but understanding. Perhaps the real question is whether any of us have the courage to let our own stories be fully known, to resist the urge to cut away the pages that reveal our vulnerabilities, our mistakes, our moments of profound human complexity. We all curate the narratives we present to the world, editing out the parts that seem too painful or too revealing. But what if those edited pages are exactly what someone needs to find, someday, to understand where they came from and why their life took the shape it did? If this story made you think about the secrets families keep and the truths that wait to be discovered, subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the hidden corners of human experience. Leave a like if Margaret's journey resonated with you, and share this story with someone who understands that the past is never really past. It's always present, waiting for someone brave enough to look closely. Comment below and tell us, would you open that sealed envelope or would you let some mysteries remain unsolved?